Mr. Paul's classes. I want to thank Mr. Paul for letting you come. Thank your teachers for letting you spend the next 2 periods here. But the little bit about it, I have Nick Haberman's here. He's part of the Light Foundation, and they and the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh are sponsored our talk. Is in contact with Mr. Prestia, and when I had a speaker last year, I asked, they gave me a speaker via the Zoom. It was a great experience, and this time they said, you know, Mrs. Frank, we have your speaker, and I'm like, what? And Mr. Prestia is from Riverside. His daughter went to school here, and we're really excited to have him here. Okay, so we a lot of times have Holocaust survivors. We've talked to them over Zoom. We've read their stories. And when I had you last year, but you're not a sophomore now, we've studied all of this from a survivor's perspective, sometimes a helper's perspective, but I have never taught it from the liberator's perspective. So this is a really unique opportunity, and I ask that you give him your attention. Did we turn this back on?
I don't know.
No.
Okay. Yeah, it's on, yeah?
It's on, you're on.
Now you can hear me. I'm glad you can hear me because I can't hear very well. After all these years, I have a loss in hearing. I do wear hearing aids, but they're not everything they're cracked up to be. I mean, they're helpful, but I have trouble on a telephone. When I receive a telephone message, I can't make out the sound is okay, but I can't distinguish the words that the people are saying. But anyway, that happens. You'll find out when you get older. Things change in your life. But anyhow, yeah, I'll start off. I don't know what you're going to start with. You're going to start with questioning.
Yes, Sam, you want to come up?
Yeah.
Sam's going to ask you the questions.
Oh, you're going to ask me a question. Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Can you describe your initial thoughts and reactions upon entering Dachau?
Oh, how I felt when I went in there. Well, when we were in Dachau, we weren't prepared for anything that we saw. Most of the people that were in there with me, they had been in the military for, since we even started in Sicily, an invasion there. So when we went in, we saw a lot of things that we were not prepared to see. We not only saw the people who were surviving, but we saw many people who had died. They were dying in there every hour. There were people there. So what we saw there was just a lot of things that you could not imagine that a human being would put somebody else through what they had to go through. So it was very, very emotional. It was just a thing that we didn't have the words to explain how we felt or anything, but I can remember that some of the soldiers that we had were replacements. Some of them had been with us for several years. Some of the soldiers, when they saw the things that had happened there, all the atrocities and things like that had happened, they did a couple of things. A lot of them started to vomit. A lot of them cried. And a lot of us did both. We were just not prepared to see anything like we saw in that camp. And that's about it that I can say about that. But there are a lot of things that happened before we got there. Going along the outside and saw those railway cars with logs stacked on them, but they were not logs. When we got closer, we saw that they were dead bodies. There were men, women, children on that train. There were about 39 cars, I believe there was. But going in there, then we saw so many things that, like I say, we were not used to. And we saw so many things, but I'll explain a little bit more later on with another question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay? You're welcome, I'm sure.
In addition to what you saw, what do you remember about what you heard, what you felt, and what you smelled at the camp?
Well, what I heard most of all in the beginning, there were people there from all nationalities, from all different countries. And I saw the people, like the Polish people, they would gather together because they could speak their language. And they didn't know what was going on for a while because so many of them were back in the barracks. They weren't even up in the place where the big parade ground that they had there, and where the crematorium and the other buildings were. So what we saw there was just people talking with each other. And whenever it comes to the smell, you never get rid of that, because we saw in one building, we saw one stack of bodies. They were just naked bodies. They were ready to go in the crematorium there, and they fired those ovens with coal, and they were doing that, and it was just a shocking thing. But what was more shocking than anything else was that you could smell the burning flesh of the people. And that is something that we were not used to. We were not trained for that. It was just something that was just out of this ordinary. Things we saw and smelled and saw people. There was so much chaos in it. There was so much confusion at the time. And our company commander there, who became a lieutenant colonel, he was in charge. And he had to fire his gun up in the air to stop what was going on at the coal yard. But we'll explain a little bit more of that in another question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We, the high school students, are not that much younger than you were when you helped to liberate the camp. What impact did that experience have on you then? When were you there as a young adult?
I didn't understand part of that question.
You didn't hear it.
Okay.
I don't hear too well, but anyway.
What impact did that experience have on you then? When were you a young adult?
What impact did it have on you?
Huh?
What age were you? And what impact did it have on you as a young adult?
Okay. Well, I was 23 years old at the time, because whenever I started off, I was, we went into Sicily, and I was only just out of training center down in Camp Wheeler, Georgia, and then I went up to Camp Pickett in Blackstone, Virginia, and we went overseas to North Africa, and our first invasion was in Sicily. And I can remember those days and things that went on in Sicily, and the impact that I had there was we had so many people that had been with our outfit when we were in the Dachau. Some of them were replacements. They hadn't been overseas very long. But we saw many soldiers like myself that had started off in Sicily, and we were already overseas at least 3.5 years before we went into Dachau. So, but we were hardened soldiers. We had seen death on every hand, different battles all over different countries, and but what we saw in Dachau was something that it just boggles your mind that somebody could treat another human being that way, because there was a lot of experimentation that they did. One of them that they did, they would take one of the inmates and put him in a tub of ice water and see how long he would live in there, because that was a test for them, for their paratroopers. If they ever jumped out of a plane and landed in the ocean, they wondered how long they would live. Another test that they gave, they injected a lot of women, even the ones that were pregnant, they injected them with different kind of diseases to see how long they would live. And it was experimentation on all hands, and they just did a lot of things. We saw the different instruments that they used for torture, and we saw, like I say, we saw the ovens where they put the people in, and it was just terrible. It was beyond anything that we could ever imagine, what we saw and what we smelled. It was just terrible. Thank you.
Wasn't that 3 days after your birthday?
Yeah, I had a birthday in April the 26th, and we went into Dachau on April the 29th, 3 days later. And I was 23 years old at the time. And if you want to know the date of my birth, that was in 1922. So next month I'll be 100 years old. So that's a long time. But I can still remember a lot of things. There are a lot of things that you want to forget, but a lot of things you can't forget. But that is one thing in Dachau, that you can never forget those things that happened. Yeah.
How has that experience of liberating a camp affected your life since, especially since you were so young at the time?
Well, yeah, the age that we had there, like I say, we were hardened soldiers, you know, when we were in there. But what it did more than anything else, when you're a certain age, you're growing up, you know, what do you think about? You think mostly about yourself. And that is something that makes a change in you whenever you're in the military, and what you have to go through and where you were and what you had to do, the orders you had to follow. Then you become more like a compassionate person. You are in a state of mind that you want to treat other people the way you want to have them treat you. It's just like living by the golden rule. That's what it is, you know. So you have more compassion, and you learn to deal with things in a way that would beneficial not only to yourself but to the other person. You have to treat other people like you want to be treated. That was one of the main things, yeah. That's the impact that leaves on a person. There was one thing that bothered me more than anything else. Whenever I came home, they had automobiles that sometimes the setting on whatever it is, the timing on a car would backfire, would make a loud noise. And whenever I heard that, I wanted to jump off the curb and dive into a ditch or something like that, because that stays with you for a long time, those explosions, when you get hit by artillery or some kind of weapon. And it's just automatic that your life changes that way. But I was fortunate in one way too. It never bothered me whenever I went to bed, went to sleep. A lot of soldiers, a lot of people that had been in combat, they have visions of that. They dream about it, but that never happened to me, and that was and I was glad it didn't. You know, that it didn't bother me after I was asleep. That was good. Yeah. But while I was there, it was just something that we couldn't comprehend. We just couldn't understand what was going on.
What is the most important lesson you want me and other young people to learn from your experience?
Oh, the most important lesson? Well, I'll tell you, you're part of it right now. I would say that at your age, you want to obey your parents first of all, because they have lived through so much, and the advice that they would give you is something that you have to take into stock. You have to understand that. Another thing would be that your teachers in the school, there will come a time later on where you'll probably wish that you paid more attention to some of your teachers, because it's easy to get away from that. But they are here for a reason. They are here to mold you into a person, to be an adult and have a good character about yourself, so that people can look at you and have respect for you. So those are things that I could say about it. You can learn that. In the military is one place where you get to learn about discipline. You have to have discipline. So when it comes your way at your age, I mean, don't get upset about it. Just take it in your stride and do things which, like I said, I told one of the other students, treat other people like you want to be treated yourself. Those are the main things. And then another thing that you should do at your age, you could start now and focusing on what you're going to do in the future. Whether you're going to continue on in education, go to school, and what career you're going to be doing, and what you want to do the rest of your life. Because those things, those years, they come by pretty fast, and you want to be prepared for those things. Okay?
Thank you.
Did you ever talk about what you witnessed with your family, and how did they react to hearing your story?
When I came home from the service, I was like with a lot of other veterans that came home when the war was over. And I mean both wars, the war in Europe, which I was involved in, and the one in the Japanese area in the Pacific. When we came home, there were, I think, 18 million Americans that were in the war, World War II. There were even the women, the WACs, the WAVES, and the ones that were nurses, doctors. So out of those people, there was somebody from their family or their relative that were in the war also. So most of the people that came home, we were all in the same boat. You either went back to your former job, or you went to school, or you did something else in your career. And so in the very beginning, we didn't talk about it at all to anybody, even family members. It wasn't until later on I explained to some of the people here that my granddaughter, who's a daughter from Patty here, she was in the 6th grade in this school. And she had Mrs. Dwyer for her teacher. And so she said that Mrs. Dwyer mentioned something about World War II, and she raised her hand and says, my grandpa was in World War II, and he brought home a German medal, which I have right there, that I took off of a dead person, a dead German. And then a few days later, Mrs. Dwyer called me on the phone and had me come there to the school there, the 6th graders there, and give a talk there. So once I went there, then I got calls from other schools. Then I've been to several schools for the last, I don't know how many years, 30-some years. So I never turn it down as long as I'm able to go there. I have a friend who takes me out of town because I drive today, but I don't drive that far away. I drive mostly local. I don't drive much at night or anything like that. But those are things that you do and you've taken your stride in your life and everything like that, but you can get a lot of advice from a lot of different people, but you have to get the ones that you know that you're going to keep and press on that way, right?
Thank
Okay.
you.
Is it okay if I speak here for a minute? My father never really talked about the war to us when I was growing up. I was probably a young adult when he would start having conversations about it with me. The first time he ever spoke publicly was to my daughter's 6th grade class, and that was 21 years ago. After that, I used to take him to his Army reunions, and he was talking to a friend of his, Van Barfoot, who was a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient that was in his unit. And Van told him, anytime you get a chance to speak to young people, please do so, because they need to know these things. They need to know what happened so that it doesn't happen again. And since that time, he has spoke to quite a few schools, colleges, Rotary clubs, historical societies, Zoom meetings. During this COVID time, he Zoomed with a class in Canada, even. It's because you need to know what happened. So many people try to say that these stories are not true, and they are. And we don't ever want to see it happen again. Thank you. Next question.
Did you ever come into contact with any of the SS guards, and how did that impact you?
Yeah, we saw, in Dachau, we saw the guards that were left there. There was one section in that camp where they had an assembly place there where they had a lot of soldiers if they had to give them certain instructions or something like that. So there were a lot of guards there. But the commander of the camp there, Heinrich Himmler, he saw the Americans coming down there, and he knew that he was going to have to surrender. So he got all of his SS troops, which were the cream of the crop. These were soldiers that were highly trained, and so he escaped. He took off from there, and he told the guards there when he left, he says, for the next few days, I don't want to see one person alive in this camp. And so he took off. But later on, we had discovered that he was afraid he might be tried like so many of them were. So many of those officers were tried for their war crimes, and they were hanged. And he thought, well, they're going to get him sooner or later. So he had a friend that got a cyanide pill for him, so he took that pill and committed suicide. But the guards that were left, they were at one part of the camp called the coal yard wall, and the coal was there to fire up those ovens, fire up the furnaces where they burnt the people's bodies. And they were told to stand in line. There were 58 of them altogether, those guards that were standing there. And there was so much confusion going on. When we went in there, we had one fella in there with a machine gun. We had another one there with, we all had rifles or some kind of weapon, but these were guards, and they were standing there, and they were told not to move, just stand still there. So they stood for a little while, and then one or two of them moved ahead, moved out of the line, just moved ahead. And then some of the soldiers opened up with fire, with carbines and with their M1s or O3s or whatever they were carrying. They start firing in there. So all the guards there, those 58, they all fell down on the ground. There was only 4 that stood up. But when things cleared up, we had our Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks. He saw the confusion going on there, and he come nearby and he pulled out his .45 and he started firing it up in the air. And finally, he said that there'll be no more firing. Everybody hold your fire. These people are surrendering. No matter what they did or who they are, you don't kill them like that in cold blood. He said, just stop the firing. So he did that. So we were around those people, the guards and everything like that. So when they all fell to the ground and things cleared up, they all stood up, but only 18 of them didn't get up. They were killed, about 18 of them out of those 58. So right there, that was probably the only ones that were killed in that camp. Maybe between 50 or 60 people altogether were killed. So it wasn't a place like it was going to be a big battle or anything. This was a camp where they were going to surrender, and they knew that that was going to happen. So we did have contact with some of those men, some of those guards and everything. And they were good enough to take us into the different parts of the camp and show us what they had to do and what they did with a lot of the bodies and how they were cremated and how they were killed. They showed us the gas chamber. And with Heinrich Himmler, what he did, he gave one of his soldiers a medal for some sort of a contraption, some unit they had. Every once in a while, they would have a group of the inmates going into the room and take a shower. And they had, every one of them had tattoos, numbers and everything on their arms, and I don't know what they used to determine who was going to get eliminated, who was going to be survived in there. I didn't know that, but what I did know, that when I went into this room to take a shower, this contraption that this soldier invented, all the water stopped running, and poison gas came through those lines. And that nitrate gas was so powerful that nobody could live more than 8 minutes. And that was one way that they eliminated a lot of the people. But there were so many things done at that camp that you could not understand. Like I say, it was a place too for experimentation. They injected women with malaria and different things to see how long they were. But there were people that were dying there every hour. There were people that were dying. And the stench there was just so bad that you can never forget about that. And the things that happened at that time is something that you just carry on the rest of your life. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Before to tell
Yeah, well, I can talk a little bit about.
whatever you want to say.
Yeah, okay. Well, when I was 20 years old, I was just out of high school and I was working in the machine shop. I wanted to be a machinist, and that was something that I did before the war, and even after the war, I stayed with that trade. And but I was 20 years old, and I got drafted, and I went down to Camp Wheeler, Georgia, which was outside of Macon. Took basic trainings down there, and then from that camp they sent me up to Camp Pickett, northern part in the Blue Ridge Mountains up there, and I took mountain maneuvers. And my 45th Division was an outfit that was made up of, in the beginning, it was the National Guards from 4 different states. And those states were Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. And at that time, before I got into the service, the emblem that they had was a swastika. It was an Indian omen. And so whenever they found out what Hitler was doing, and he had that swastika every place, and this design had to be changed. So it had to, the only restriction was it had to have 4 sides to it, which is, they call it the Thunderbird. It had 4 sides for those 4 states. And it was an Indian omen that out west, where the ground is really dry, they would pray to that big bird. And when it flew over, the lightning would come out of its eyes. And then when it flapped his big wings, that made the thunder. And then when it went over the dry areas on its back, it had this great big lake of water. And so when it got over to the dry areas where the Indians had planted their corn, it did a turnover, and all that water came down and watered the plants and everything down there. So that was the idea of the Thunderbird. That's what we had. So that insignia that we have on one side there, that I have it here, is a Thunderbird. See, it has 4 sides to it. And those 4 sides are Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. And then this is my stripes. I was a sergeant there. When I got that, then I was in charge of a squad. I had either 10 or 12 men in my squad. And you wonder why the 2, why there was only, well, we had 2 in case we had a medic that was assigned to our squad, and then a runner that carried messages from one company to another. So sometimes we had 2 extra men, but we had altogether either 10 or 12 men in the squad. And so we went from Blue Ridge Mountains. We were waiting for the 45th Division, which had come clear across the country. And at this point in time, they were up in Pine Camp in New York. So they came down to Blackstone, and that's when they loaded up. They loaded up for the 45th Division, and they put me in that one. They put me in that. So I went overseas with them, and so we went to North Africa, to Oran, and then from there we were getting, that campaign in North Africa was just winding down. It was just about over, so we didn't have any action at all in Africa. My older brother was in North Africa, and he was with the 40-millimeter Beaufort shooting at airplanes. He had that occupation there. So we were getting ready to go into Sicily, and that was July the 10th, 1943. I think I got that right. But there was a storm coming on, and we were supposed to go in 2 weeks ahead of time. They predicted a storm and thought, well, nobody will be on the beach there waiting for you during the storm. So the breakers on the water that night we went in, they were 13 foot high. So those little assault boats that we had, we were going to go in there, about 40, 45 men in a boat. And it was either 1 or 2 sandy beaches where we were supposed to get out of the boat. The guys from the Navy, they're the ones that drove those boats. And they were supposed to hit either 1 or 2, either Gala or Scoglito beaches. So we were trained to hit a beach like that, that the lid up in the front would open up the door and we would walk out. But the boat that I was in on the first wave, they missed the beach altogether and he hit a big rock. When he hit that rock, he was good enough that he didn't turn around and go back to the boat to get more soldiers. He kept gunning that engine on that rock, so one person climbed up onto the rock and each soldier pulled each one out of there. But there was a bad accident that happened there about 2 o'clock that morning when we were in a rendezvous area. The commander that was in the boat had everybody fix bayonets, thinking that, well, there'll be some skirmish there on the beach. But I couldn't fix a bayonet because I carried a BAR, a Browning automatic rifle. It weighs, altogether weighs 21 pounds, so it's not made to carry a bayonet. But the ones that were crouched down, and when we hit that rock, you can imagine what happened. Some of the guys speared the one ahead of them with their bayonet, and that was a bad decision that was made. You should have never had people fix bayonets. So the one fellow we picked up, put him on a beach over there, he had lost so much blood that he just died right there. But then the rest of them got wounded, like in their legs or in their back. They got stuck, but not too deep or something like that. But a lot of those guys got injured on that. But that was a bad thing that happened, you know. But then other things happen too, you know. When you're in the service, it seems like every day there's something. Now, this outfit that I was in, we had been into the different countries in Europe. We had been in not only Sicily, but we've been in Italy and over in Monte Cassino where they have that monastery on a hill that had to be bombed out because it was an FO there, forward observation post for the German artillery. And then we made the invasion also in southern France and went clear across France. And then we were introduced to different types of weapons. They had a 6-barrel mortar. The mortars that we had would fire one shell at a time. So the Germans introduced to us a 6-barrel mortar. It was like on a carousel. And whenever those things let go, they had a wide spread of damage that was done. Not only close by with one shell, but about with 6 shells. So those were bad. They had the big tanks, the M6s that came in, and we saw in the eastern part of the state there, or the east part of the country, that one big tank, the Mark 6, knocked out 5 of our Sherman tanks in one day. The Sherman tanks we had were good, but they were small. They were medium-sized tanks. So we didn't have the big artillery like the Germans had. But they run out of things toward the end because, you know, they had to go underground. There was so much bombing. Our Air Force had bombed out so many industry places where they were making stuff for war. So they had to go underground. And they start running out of fuel, and they even start running out of people because we start getting men that came in with their hands over their head. They were like 79 years old. And then we also had on the other end of the spectrum, we saw kids, teenagers. They were only 14 and 15 years old. They were soldiers, and they gave up. They saw that the war was not good for them. They didn't care about Hitler, so they gave up right away. So they run out of things like that too. So there's a lot of different stories that happened, you know, with our place. But the unit that I was in, the 45th Division, you could check me out on that. We had 511 days in combat. So that's a lot of days to go from one battle to another. And when you're over there that long, you're about ready. I stayed in another 6 months. I was with the outfit for 3.5 years. And then we went from Dachau to Munich. And like I say, there wasn't much fighting, much resistance there. Munich is, I think, the third largest city in Germany. And it was bombed so heavily from the air that when we went in there was only a few tanks left. There was some snipers around there, but hardly any resistance. So, but by then, it got to be May the 8th, and that's when the war ended. The war ended in Europe on May the 8th, but it was still ongoing in the Pacific. So, but there were different places that I had been in, different things that we had seen, and some of the battles were large, some of them were smaller, just skirmishes, but war is a bad thing, no matter where you're at and what happens. A lot of things can happen, so I don't know what else you might want to hear. I have that Purple Heart, but I didn't even want to accept the thing because I wasn't hurt that bad. I got hit with a mortar shell, and I got one fragment in my leg and another one in my chest. So I was in a field hospital for only 3 days, and that wasn't very much. So I could still walk and everything like that, but they took care of me. But it's one of those things that happens, you know, but...
He was only in there 3 days because he went AWOL and left the hospital.
Yeah, I have to tell you
He's not
about
a
going
good
AWOL. I left. We had inspection in the mornings, and there was a major. He was a doctor. He was in charge. It was a field hospital, and he came in there for inspection, and I wasn't in my bed, and he waited for me. So when I came back in, I went outside. He said, "Soldier, where you been?" And I says, "I went out to the latrine out there, outside." He says, "You're supposed to be in bed." He says, "Who do you think you are?" See, now he had rank on me because I was a sergeant, but he was a major. But anyway, he read the riot act at me, and I just didn't like his attitude. He said, you know, he says, "We have nurses in here, we have doctors here." He says, "We have urinals, we have bedpans." He says, "If you have to go," he says, "you just give us a signal and you'll get the help right here in bed." So I didn't like his attitude. So that afternoon, the third day I was there, I saw a truck. It was a tanker, and on a bumper it had 45th Division headquarters. So I asked the driver, I said, "You going up to the outfit again?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "When you leaving?" He says, "Right away." I said, "Can I ride with you?" And he said, "Yeah, jump in." So I jumped in, and he took me up there, and I went to my company commander, who was Felix Sparks, and I went right up to him, and I says, "Captain," I says, "I'm in trouble." He says, "What's that?" I said, "Well," I said, "I left that hospital down there. I don't have any discharge papers. I just went AWOL." I said, "I suppose right now the MPs are looking for me." And he said, "Well, I'll guarantee you, they're probably looking for you, you know, but you can count on one thing." He says, "They're not going to come up here because we're near the front lines again." He said, "So go back and get your gear ready." He says, "In the morning we're going to be pulling out." They were in the rest area at the time. So I get in, and he says, "As far as the MPs," he says, "don't worry about that." He says, "I'll take care of that." But they never did show up. He was right. They're not going to go up there. in the front lines, you know, to find out about anything. They would go look in other places where I'd be having a good time, maybe, but I wanted to be back to my outfit. I just couldn't stay away very long. And I didn't like I say, the attitude of that officer. We had some of them that treated you pretty nice, and other ones were pretty mean. But they had the commission, you know, and they wore the uniform, so you had to respect them. Yeah. Do you have any other questions?
Tell them about going to see Uncle Rocky, the flight you took when you, Mount Vesuvius.
Oh, yeah, the first time I took a flight in a plane, yeah. I had, my older brother was over in Foggia, Italy, because from North Africa, when that campaign ended, they had to put their outfit into, so they put him in some kind of a unit where they guarded airfields and things like that. So he was over in Foggia. So Mount Vesuvius at the time was erupting, a volcano there in Naples, right north of Naples. So I inquired, I said, I have a brother that is over in the eastern part there. I said, I'd like to go visit him for 3 days. So they said, okay, you could go down and talk to the pilot. So I talked to the pilot and the co-pilot. And they said, yeah, we can fly over there, we could take you. So they took, I think, 12 or 13 of us GIs. Some of them were from the Air Force, from the ground crew, and some of them were military in different outfits. And so before we got on that plane, they strapped on parachutes on themselves, and they didn't give us anything. So they took off in this plane, and it was a pile of junk. I mean, it should have been in a scrapyard because there was no armament on it. There was nothing, it just looked like it was all banged up. And so they wanted to see the volcano, so instead of going directly across country, there was about 150 miles away. We would have been up in the air just little under an hour. So they flew right over top of Vesuvius, and from the ground, it looks like it comes to a point, but when you're up there, it's like a saucer. It's like maybe 2 or 3 blocks long. So they flew right over top of the thing, and all these rocks and lava and everything was coming out, and I thought, these guys are gonna ditch this airplane. What are we gonna do? You know, no parachutes on us or anything? So anyhow, the captain there of this aircraft, he says, now walk with me. He said, I'm gonna put you in the radio compartment room. He said, it has a floor on it. The rest of the places don't have any floors. These guys, these gunners, like the waist gunner, the turd gunner, the tail gunners, and all that, they would strap them in there, and they had their 50 caliber machine guns. And so he said, now when we get over there to Foggia, he said, I want you to sit down on the floor because that's a rough field to land on. He says, so if you're going to be standing up, you're going to hit your head up on the ceiling. He said, maybe get hurt there. So I said, okay. So I walk across the side beam, and I look down there about 10 feet down. There is a bomb base. There was no bombs on there, but all the mechanism, all machinery is down there. And I thought, boy, if I slip off of this I-beam, I could get killed just falling in that mess of ironwork. So anyway, as we were flying over there, from the radio compartment room, I could see one engine. The B-17, as you know, has 4 engines on it. And I could see one engine. This is the first time I was ever in an airplane. And I saw this one engine, and it was on fire. And anytime I saw a movie and saw an airplane on fire, it's going to go down. The pilot and co-pilot, they didn't pay attention to it, nothing at all. So they went there, and they were right. He was right, was a field. And then all the soldiers that were on there, the ones who were in the Air Force, they had a card with them. And they got flight time for any amount of time they were in the airplane going any place. They got more time on their pay. And so he gave them all, instead of 55 minutes, he gave them 1 hour. Then whenever I got to the front to get out of the plane, he said, "How long you got?" He said, "Let me see your card." I put some time on there. I said, "I don't have a card." I said, "I'm in the infantry. We don't have a card like that." He said, "Well, how long are you going to be here?" I said, "For 3 days." And he said, "Well, we'll be going back to around Naples at that time." He says, we'll take you back." I said, "Okay." When I got out of there, I thought to myself, "You'll never get me on that plane to go anywhere." I had enough of that. I mean, so then I met a guy that was in the Air Force, and I told him about that parachute deal. He said, "Well, it wouldn't do you any good." He says, "You know, when you get trained to do that, you have to know what kind of those ropes that you pull so you can guide it. Otherwise, you might land someplace you don't want to land. And when you hit the ground, you have to know how to roll so you don't get hurt, because you could break your shoulder, you could break your leg if you don't land right when you have that parachute on you." And I said, "Well, that sounds right, but you know, if I have to dive off of an airplane," I said, "I'm not going to sprout wings." I said, "I have to have some kind of protection, so the parachute would be a help." He said, "Now about that oil being on that," he said, "that happens all the time on those engines." He says, "It just leaks a lot of oil, catches on fire." He says, "In time it'll just burn off." I said, "Oh, that's fine." I said, "But they didn't explain any of this stuff to me before I got on that plane." Because I said I was never on a plane before. But that was my experience. So I got to see my brother there for 3 days. And then when I went back again on another truck. Went back on another truck to my outfit. That was enough. That was my airplane ride, B-17. But I didn't enjoy that very much at all. Yeah. Do you have any other
Yeah,
questions?
does anyone have a question? Anyone want to ask any questions? So I have a question. When we were reading, you said you didn't know anything about what you were going to in Dachau. They told you to swing by and see what was going on.
Yeah.
And the article you read said you had heard of Auschwitz, but you didn't understand what you were going to be walking into.
Yeah. Yeah, what happened was whenever we got down there, we were on our way to Munich, which was, like I said, 30 miles away. But our commanding officer there got a message there to swing down by Dachau and see what's going on. So when we went down there, we were on the back side of the camp, and we saw these 39 cars there. And from a distance, walking near there, they looked like logs that were stacked on that train. And we got closer and we found out they were all bodies. They were dead. They were all men, women, and children on there. There was one man that was on there that was still alive. So our outfit, they just moved some of the bodies out, and they got him out, turned him over to the medics, and took him to maybe one of the hospitals or something. I don't know whether he even lived or not. So, yeah, we went in that way, and then I think in order to get inside, you had to go up a masonry wall, which was 30 foot high. There was a fellow in our outfit, I think his name was Joe Negri, was his name. He was from Columbus, Ohio. And he climbed up the wall and jumped over the inside, and he opened up the gates for us to walk in. So we got in there, but it was a camp probably that nobody ever escaped, because on top they had several machine gun emplacements on the towers, had certain towers. And if a person climbed up and got as high as a wall, they would unleash those Doberman dogs, and they only fed them halfway. They were hungry, and they would probably just grab the prisoners and maybe chew them apart. And if they did get to the top, the barbed wire that was stretched across was all electrified, so they would get electrocuted even with the wires. So I don't think anybody ever escaped from Dachau. It was, but they had a lot of barracks there. It was built in 1933, one of the first camps that they had. But in Germany alone, I had learned in Washington, D.C. at the Holocaust Museum that there were over 300 camps in Germany alone. And they were sub-camps. They're just a spin-off from Dachau. But we had heard about different places. We heard about Buchenwald. We heard about Auschwitz in Poland. We heard about concentration camps from other soldiers. We heard, but we didn't know that we were ever going to be in one of them. And to see what we saw and experiment the different things that went on in that camp. It was just something that was beyond description. You just couldn't imagine. You couldn't fathom anything that would be happening to people. So, but the ones that survived out of there, we were allowed to, we weren't allowed to give them any food at all. They were so undernourished that the medics told us that if you gave them any food, that would probably kill them. So what we were allowed to do, we could give them cigarettes and we could give them hardtack candy. Now, I had a lot of candy in my backpack because I was never a smoker, so I would get my 6 cigarettes that we got every day, and I would trade them with my soldiers. They gave me their plastic bag with candy in it, hardtack candy, and I gave them the cigarettes that I had. So there were times when we traveled through different places, some of the towns that were evacuated, that people were leaving and they were taken off, and as they were going to higher grounds or other neighboring places they knew would be safer, these little kids would follow us. They would follow us, and I always had candy to give these kids and give the smile that would be on their face. And especially in Italy, they're going through there. I'd give them a candy, and they'd look at it and they'd say, "Una for mama, una for papa." They wanted one for their mother and their father to take with them, but I had enough candy to give them, so I'd give them whatever they wanted. So, yeah, there was another thing there and happened in Sicily. We had captured Comiso Airport the second or third day we were on the island. It was about 20 miles away. And you get on the infantry, you walk. And we walked that 20 miles up there, carrying our backpacks and everything. And so we went to this airfield. And the first day we were there, we captured 450 soldiers. They were German and Italian soldiers together. And we captured 120 airplanes that were on the field. And we also captured, I think it was 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel. This is why Hitler wanted Mussolini on his side. The Italians at that time had a good airfield, different places. They had airfields, they had good planes, they had good pilots, they had plenty of fuel and everything, and he wanted them on his side. So that's why they joined up together. But then there was one time where we had captured so many Italian people, because when we got to the main part of Italy, Badaglio, who was in charge of the Italian army, he said, he told all his soldiers, just throw your rifles on the ground and go home. He says, get out of this war. So they quit. So after that, we didn't have to fight with the Italians. So one of the majors there told me to get 19 of these soldiers and take them to the camp, which was about 7 or 8 kilometers away. And so I took them. Now these guys were only 19, 20, 21 years old. So I gave my BAR to my second in command, the assistant, because the BAR squad has 3 men. You have the gunner, you have the assistant gunner, you have the ammo carrier. The other 2 men, they have an 03 or an M1. I had the BAR, which was fully automatic, and you had to have other men to carry a canister with extra bullets in there because it used so much. And if you put it on automatic with that, the rifle itself weighed, there's a picture of it here, it weighed 17 pounds. Then the bipod in the front weighed 3 pounds. That took it up to 20. Then one magazine of 20 rounds weighed 1 pound. So altogether it was 21 pounds. But it fired, when you put it on automatic and just put your finger on the trigger, you got rid of those 20 rounds in 2.5 seconds. So it was next to a machine gun as having the firepower. So anyway, getting back to taking these 9 guys to a camp, we got to a place. I said, well, we're going to take a break here. So I had a lot of chewing gum too in my backpack. So I gave these guys all a stick of gum, and they put it in their mouth, and they couldn't handle it. They didn't know what it was for. They were chewing it, but they couldn't swallow it. They didn't know. So one guy would look at another and they would laugh, and so sooner or later they'd start just spitting it out. They didn't know. So I had to explain to these guys, you know, I said, questa caramella non è per mangiare, solamente masticare ma non utile. I told him, it is some kind of a sweet candy. I said, but it's not for chewing. I said, you can chew it, but you can't swallow it. They could not get the hang of it. And I couldn't say, see, these guys are 19 years old, 20, 21 years old, never had a stick of gum. But the little kids found out real quick on how to handle chewing gum. Yeah, they learned real quick. Yeah, so there are things like that that happened that I never forget. There was another time we saw an evacuation going on, and we saw the people going to higher grounds. And my dad used to tell us all the time that over there they have a lot of vineyards. The young ladies pick a lot of grapes, and that's one of their jobs. They go and everything that they have there they carry on their head. Now on their head they have something that's braided, it's round. I don't know what it's made out of, but they have that because these baskets carry the grape. They're tapered down, and so that round, the part on the bottom fits into that ring, and they carried it from the vineyard back to where they're going to process the grapes. And by doing that, after all these years, these kids started as when they're 10, 12 years old. Their muscles in their neck just bulge. And I saw that when I was over there, and I saw some girls where their necks were bulged like that, and so they must have been working in those vineyards. And so this one time, when I saw an evacuation, I saw people going to another place. And when you leave on evacuation, what would you do? You would take your most possession article that you have. And so I saw this one girl, she must have been about 19 or 20 years old. She was walking straight up the hill, and on her head, balanced on her head, was a Singer sewing machine. Now I knew what that was because I could read it there, Singer. My mother had one of those at home. It doesn't have an electric motor on it, it has a treadle, and you pump that with your feet to get the pulley going, and it's non-electric. So she had the lid closed, it was upside down, but I could read that, see what Singer. She was walking up there, and probably she was making clothes for her children or for other people, but that was her prized possession, was that Singer sewing machine. And those things are heavy too, and she was walking up there with that on her head. So those are the things that you see, you know. It's amazing what you can see with your outside like that, going from one place to another. Yeah. We had another fella in our outfit, he said, I'm getting tired of this war. He says, I'm going to go home. We said, Joe, Marciniak was his name, he said, I'm going to shoot off one of my toes. Now in the infantry, you got to take care of your feet because you do a lot of walking. And he said, so we pulled into a rest area one time, and people are cleaning their guns and taking care of things like that. And we hear this one shot, and then we said, uh-oh, that must be Joe. So then he just jumped all around, you know, and put on an act, you know. He's gonna get to go home. So here about 3 days later, they took him back to an aid station. 3 days later, we see Joe walking back up to our outfit. We said, Joe, what happened? We thought you'd be on your way home right now. He said, well, he said, I tried, he said, but it just didn't work out. So what he did, he put his rifle on his boot and he fired it. And so instead of hitting his toe, the bullet went between his big toe and his next toe. And what it did, he had a little abrasion there, so they put some iodine on it or something like that, sent him back to our outfit, and he never lived that down. We said, boy, you were supposed to be up here helping us fight the Germans. He said, you can't even shoot off a toe. He said, well, he says, I tried, he said, but it didn't work out. Some people were smart enough, if they got caught doing that, they would get court-martialed and probably sent back to the States, to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, to be there as a prisoner. And they wouldn't be released till after the war. But anyway, some of the people played it smart. They would get a loaf of bread. All the bread that you saw in those countries was not refined. They didn't have flour that was white. So they just used grain, you know, rye or wheat or something like that. So some of them that wanted to get rid of a toe on their foot, they would take a loaf of bread and put it on top of their shoe and then fire down through there. Then the bread would pick up the powder. So there was no proof there that, you know, that it was an accident or it was self-inflicted. But the Army did not like those self-inflicted wounds. They
Frowned upon it.
yeah. There was another fella, there was another guy that was in my outfit. One afternoon, the staff sergeant came down and said, if somebody's going to be put in your squad, some young fella as a replacement. And so he came there, and he was carrying he's carrying an M1. So I told him, I said, now you see this gun that I have? I said, it's a Browning automatic, a BAR. I said, you have to keep it clean because it is fully automatic. If you get sand in it or anything like that, it might misfire, it won't work, and you need it sometime, maybe to save your life. And I said, the one that you have there is an M1. I said, that's a semi-automatic. It also has to be kept clean. And I said, do you know how to do this? He said, no. He said, I don't know anything about guns. I said, what do you mean? He said, I was never on a rifle range. I said, you're never on a rifle range and you come out here as a replacement? He said, yeah. And I said, well, I'm going to have to show you something. So I took his gun and I took it apart, field stripped it, showed him how to clean it, how to take care of it and load it up with ammunition and everything, explained everything that I could. And I said, now, later on, if you need any more help, just give me a call. I'll be up at the head of the column with the BAR squad. And he said, okay. So that night, I hear this one shot. And I knew it was down here by the squad that I had. So I walked back there, and then leaning up against the side of the hill was this one kid. He was 19 years old. He shot himself right in the head, killed himself. Now, when something like that would happen, the company commander would probably get from his dog tags, get his name, where he was from and everything, and then there would be a couple men from Washington that would go to his parents' house and tell them that their son was killed in action. And that would be a lot better for them to take that than to say that he committed suicide. So, yeah, those things happen too. He just had no training at all. And I asked him at the time, I said, well, what did you do? If you never went on a rifle range or learned anything about a gun. He said, I worked in the office. He said, with a typewriter. He said, that's all I ever did. So they sent him up. Now that was a big mistake to somebody. They should have never sent a replacement that had no training at all with weaponry, you know. He said, so those things happen too. You know, there are things like that that happen, and that's part of war. But it's too bad that happens. And yeah, that kid, he just panicked. He just couldn't take it, you know. So those things happen. Okay.